The world outside was a blur of city lights, stretching endlessly into the night. From the 40th floor of Vale Tower, Calla Everhart could see the entire city beneath her, but the sight did nothing to steady her racing heart. The skyline, the traffic below, the glimmering windows of penthouses and office buildings, it was all a backdrop to the suffocating reality she now faced. She didn't belong here. She wasn't the kind of woman who dined in places where waiters wore white gloves, who slipped into dresses that cost more than her rent, who walked into the domain of billionaires as if she belonged. But tonight, she was here. And it wasn't by choice. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms. She hadn't realized she was holding her breath until the soft chime of the elevator pulled her attention. The doors slid open with a quiet hiss, and she was met with a sight that sent ice curling through her veins. Roman Vale. The man she was supposed to spend 2 nights with. The man her stepfather had sold her to. Calla had never met him in person before tonight, but she knew who he was. Everyone did. Roman Vale was the kind of man who made people nervous without ever raising his voice. He was powerful, untouchable, and completely unreadable. His wealth came from a technology empire, but his influence extended far beyond that. And now, she was standing in his penthouse, waiting for whatever was supposed to happen next. He didn't move from where he stood near the bar. Didn't offer a greeting. He just stood there, a glass of whiskey in one hand, watching her with a quiet intensity that made her skin prickle. His suit was crisp, dark, expensive. The kind tailored to perfection, fitting his tall, lean frame as if it had been stitched onto him. Miss Everhart. His voice was smooth, deep. The kind that commanded attention without effort. Calla swallowed hard. Mr. Vale. Silence stretched between them. She had expected something different. Maybe smug arrogance. Maybe the kind of possessive entitlement she'd heard about in whispered rumors. But he wasn't looking at her like she was something to be owned. He was studying her. Assessing. Calculating. As if she were the puzzle, not him. Take a seat, he finally said, nodding toward the sleek leather chair opposite the bar. Calla hesitated. Every instinct in her screamed not to. But this wasn't just about her. It never had been. Her mother needed her to go through with this. Her stepfather had made sure of it. So she forced herself to move, crossing the room in slow, measured steps. She sat down, folding her hands in her lap, pretending she wasn't trembling inside. Roman walked toward her then, his footsteps eerily silent against the polished floors. He didn't sit. Instead, he leaned against the bar, resting his glass on the marble surface. "You don't want to be here," he said. It wasn't a question. Calla stiffened. "No. I don't." A small flicker of amusement touched his lips, though it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Then why are you?" She could have lied. Could have given him some polished, careful answer. But instead, she spoke the truth. "Because my stepfather gave me no choice." Roman's expression didn't change, but something in the air shifted. "And what exactly did he tell you?" Calla's throat was dry. She forced herself to meet his gaze, even though his eyes, storm gray, unreadable, made it difficult to breathe. "That you wanted me for 2 nights," she said evenly. "And that if I didn't agree, he'd ruin my mother's life." There. It was out. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she waited for him to confirm it. To tell her she was right. To watch as he played the role of the cold-hearted billionaire who bought women like they were commodities. But what she didn't expect was for him to laugh. It wasn't loud. Wasn't mocking. But it was real. Calla's spine went rigid. "I'm sorry, is something funny?" Roman shook his head, swirling the amber liquid in his glass before setting it down. "I think you and I were given very different versions of this deal." Her stomach dropped. What the hell does that mean? She demanded. Roman exhaled slowly, his gaze pinning her to the seat like a vice. It means, Calla, he said, voice laced with something dark, something dangerous, that your stepfather made this arrangement without ever consulting me. She blinked. What? His expression didn't waver. I never asked for you. The room felt like it was tilting. A bitter taste filled her mouth. That's not possible, she said, shaking her head. Marshall told me. Marshall Everhart is a liar, Roman cut her off. And he's desperate. Calla's stomach twisted into knots. She had known her stepfather was a bastard. Had known he was manipulative. But this? Her stepfather had sold her into a deal that wasn't even real. The air in the room grew heavier. Then why am I here? She whispered. Roman was silent for a moment. Then, finally, softly, deliberately, he said, because I let you be. Her breath caught. The way he said it. Like he had been waiting for this. Like she was a piece on a chessboard he had already moved into place. And for the first time since stepping into this penthouse, Calla realized, Roman Vale hadn't been the one trapped in a deal. She was. The silence between them stretched like an invisible rope, pulling tighter with every second. Calla felt it pressing against her skin, the weight of an unspoken truth that she was too afraid to confront. Roman Vale was not the man she had expected. She had imagined a ruthless billionaire who would demand exactly what Marshall had promised him, 2 nights, no questions asked. A man who would take what he had paid for. But now, standing in front of him, hearing those words, I never asked for you, she realized she was standing in a game she didn't understand. And worse, she had no idea which side she was supposed to be on. Her pulse roared in her ears. If you never asked for me, then why the hell did you let this happen? Roman exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening slightly before he reached for his whiskey again. He took a slow sip, savoring it, as if weighing how much he wanted to tell her. And that infuriated her. You think this is funny? Calla snapped, pushing up from the chair so fast the fabric of her dress rustled against her legs. You let my stepfather send me here like some sort of goddamn payment, and now you're drinking whiskey like this is just another business deal. Roman didn't blink. But something flickered in his expression, something unreadable. He set his glass down, resting his hands on the edge of the sleek marble bar. His fingers were long, elegant, but there was something coiled beneath them. Like a man who had spent a lifetime controlling his temper, his impulses. Then, slowly, he tilted his head, his sharp gray eyes pinning her in place. I'm not the villain you think I am, Calla, he murmured. Her breath hitched. Because for some reason, the way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine. She forced herself to hold his gaze, even as something hot curled in her stomach. Then explain it to me. Why did you let Marshall send me here? Roman was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he pushed off the bar and took a step toward her. Not aggressively, not with intimidation, but with purpose. Calla didn't move. Not because she wasn't afraid. But because for some insane reason, she wasn't. Roman Vale was dangerous. Not in the way Marshall was, with his empty threats and drunken fists, but in a different way. A way that told her if he wanted to destroy someone, he wouldn't raise his voice. Wouldn't hit them in the dark when no one was looking. He would do it in plain sight. With a single, calculated move. Roman finally stopped just inches from her, close enough that she could see the faint hint of stubble along his jaw, the sharp lines of his cheekbones. You want the truth, he said, his voice lower now, rougher. Calla swallowed. Yes. He exhaled, his breath brushing against her cheek. I let you come here because I wanted to see what kind of woman Marshall was willing to sacrifice to save his own skin. Her stomach dropped. There it was. The answer she hadn't expected. Roman wasn't here for her. He was here for revenge. Her stepfather had done something bad enough that he thought selling Calla like a pawn would fix it. But from the way Roman was looking at her now, she knew it wouldn't. Marshall had gambled. And he had lost. Calla stepped back, needing space, needing air. Her hands curled into fists, her breath coming too fast. "So what now?" she forced out. "Are you going to use me to get back at him? Because if that's the plan, I'd rather walk out that door right now." Roman's eyes darkened. His hand shot out before she could move, catching her wrist, not tightly, not painfully, but firmly. Enough to stop her. She sucked in a breath. "I don't use women," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Not for revenge. Not for anything." She didn't know why, but she believed him. And maybe that was the scariest part. His fingers lingered for a moment before he let her go, his touch burning into her skin even after he stepped away. He turned, picking up his glass again, taking a slow sip before speaking again. "You can leave if you want to, Calla." His voice was calm now, measured. "I won't stop you." Her heart stuttered. She had expected him to fight. To force her to stay. She hadn't expected this. "You mean that?" she whispered. He nodded once. "If you walk out that door, I'll make sure Marshall never comes near you or your mother again." She should have been running by now. Every instinct in her said go. Leave this behind, escape while she could. But then Roman's eyes met hers again. And deep inside, Calla knew the truth. If she walked away now, she'd never see him again. And she wasn't sure why that suddenly felt like the real loss. The air inside the penthouse felt heavier now, thick with something Calla couldn't name. Not fear, she had been afraid before, and this wasn't it. Not relief, either, because even though Roman had told her she could walk away, she knew nothing about this situation was simple. Her stepfather had set her up. Roman Vale had let it happen. And now, she stood in the middle of his world, caught in a war she hadn't even realized she was part of. She should have left. She should have turned on her heel and walked straight out of his penthouse, down the elevator, and out onto the cold New York streets. She should have called a cab, gone home, and figured out how the hell she was going to deal with Marshall when he inevitably came looking for her. But she didn't. Instead, she stayed. She had no idea why. Calla's fingers trembled slightly as she wrapped her arms around herself. She was still standing in the same spot, the soft glow of the city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her. Roman hadn't moved much either. He had gone back to leaning against the marble bar, whiskey glass in hand, watching her with that same unreadable expression. She felt like a chess piece on a board she couldn't see. "What are you thinking?" Roman's voice cut through the silence, smooth and low, but no less powerful. Calla inhaled sharply. She didn't know how to answer that. Because the truth. She was thinking about him. About the way he had said, "I never asked for you." About the way his hand had wrapped around her wrist earlier, strong but controlled, like a man who knew his own strength and chose when to use it. About the fact that, despite every warning she had ever been given about men like him, she wasn't afraid of him. And that scared her more than anything else. She squared her shoulders, forcing herself to focus. "I'm thinking about how stupid it was for me to come here in the first place." Roman exhaled, taking another slow sip of his drink before setting the glass down with a soft clink against the counter. "Agreed." The response caught her off guard. Her brows pulled together as she tilted her head, studying him. "Then why let me?" His lips quirked, but it wasn't amusement. It was something colder, sharper. "Because I wanted to see how far Marshall would go." A chill ran down her spine. "You knew he'd send me?" Roman nodded once. "I suspected." Her stomach twisted. "And you still let it happen?" His gaze didn't waver. "Yes." The word landed like a stone in her chest. You, she swallowed hard, shaking her head. You let him believe he could use me as a bargaining chip? Roman's jaw tightened slightly. I let him believe whatever he needed to, so that he would finally owe me. Cala's breath caught. Owe you? A slow nod. Marshall Everhart has spent years digging himself into a hole. Gambling. Lying. Making deals he couldn't keep. Roman's fingers tapped once against the countertop, measured and precise. I was just waiting for him to offer me something he couldn't take back. A cold realization settled in her chest. So this was never about me. Roman was quiet for a long moment before he finally said, no. But now it is. Her stomach twisted. What does that mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Roman pushed off the bar and walked toward her, slow and deliberate. Not in a threatening way, but in a way that made her breath hitch, that made her pulse drum against her skin. You think Marshall sent you here as an offering, he murmured, standing just inches from her now. That you were some kind of trade for a debt he couldn't pay. Cala forced herself to hold his gaze, even though her body was screaming at her to step back. Isn't that exactly what happened? Roman reached up then, and for one terrifying second, she thought he was going to touch her. But he didn't. Instead, he brushed his fingers lightly against the strap of her dress, barely grazing her skin before he plucked a single, loose thread from the fabric. Cala shivered. Marshall didn't send you to me as payment, Cala, Roman said softly, letting the thread drift to the floor between them. He sent you because he thought I would destroy you. Her breath stalled. Would you? She whispered, her voice unsteady. Roman's eyes darkened, but not in the way she expected. It wasn't hunger, wasn't cruelty. It was something deeper, something restrained. No, he murmured. But he doesn't know that. The words sent ice down her spine. Cala took a step back, needing distance. Roman let her, but he didn't look away. He just stood there, watching, waiting for her to process what he had just said. She felt like she was spinning, like she had walked into something far bigger than herself. Marshall had never expected her to come back from this. He had sent her to be broken. And Roman had known it all along. The weight of that realization settled in her bones. Why tell me this now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Roman tilted his head slightly. Because I want you to understand something. He took another step toward her, and even though every rational thought in her mind told her to move back, to run, she didn't. She held her ground. Roman leaned in just enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek. You're not here for 2 nights, Cala, he said, his voice dangerously soft. You're here because I let you be. A sharp breath escaped her lips. And if you hadn't? Roman's expression didn't change. Then you wouldn't have walked out of here at all. Her entire body went rigid. Not because of what he said. But because of the absolute certainty in his voice. Roman Vale hadn't been the one trapped in a deal. She was. And somewhere deep inside, she knew. She might never escape it. The walls of Vale Tower were closing in around her. Cala felt it in the way her breath came too fast, in the way the space between her and Roman Vale felt smaller and smaller, even though neither of them had moved. His words still hung in the air, wrapping around her like invisible chains. You're not here for 2 nights. You're here because I let you be. She wanted to believe he was lying. That this was some kind of game. But the problem was, Roman wasn't like Marshall. Her stepfather lied because it was easy, because it was second nature to him. Because he was a coward. Roman Vale, on the other hand. Roman didn't lie. He didn't need to. He dealt in truths so sharp they could slice through bone, and the look in his storm-gray eyes told her that everything he had just said was completely, terrifyingly real. Cala swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay standing, to keep her chin lifted. What does that mean? She asked, her voice quieter than she wanted it to be. Roman watched her for a long moment, then turned away, crossing the room with slow, deliberate steps. He picked up his whiskey glass again, rolling the amber liquid inside, watching it swirl before finally taking a sip. He was stalling. Which meant whatever he was about to say next was worse than she thought. Marshall owes me, Roman said finally, his voice smooth but edged with something cold. More than he can ever repay. Cala's pulse spiked. For what? Roman's jaw tightened slightly. Let's just say, he made a mistake. She exhaled sharply, crossing her arms over her chest. You're going to have to do better than that, Roman. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like his biggest mistake was sending me to you. Roman's lips tilted slightly, but it wasn't a smile. That was his last mistake. A chill ran down her spine. She was getting nowhere with him. Roman was giving her just enough information to keep her asking the right questions, but never enough to give her an actual answer. It was a tactic. She recognized it because she had spent years under Marshall's thumb, learning how to navigate his manipulation, learning how to protect herself when he dangled information over her head just to watch her suffer. But Roman wasn't doing this for control. He was doing it because he wanted to see how far she would push. Cala took a slow, measured breath. You said you let me come here because you wanted to see what kind of woman Marshall was willing to sacrifice. Fine. You saw me. You figured out whatever it is you needed to. Now what? Roman leaned back against the bar, setting his glass down with a quiet clink. His eyes swept over her, not in the way a man looks at something he owns, but in the way a man looks at something he doesn't quite understand yet. And Cala hated how much that unsettled her. You think this is about seeing you? He asked, tilting his head slightly. She frowned. Isn't it? Roman exhaled softly, shaking his head once. It's about keeping you. Her stomach dropped. What? He didn't look away, didn't blink. Marshall Everhart tried to hand you over to me like some kind of pawn. But what he didn't understand was that once he did that, he lost the game. She staggered back. Jesus Christ, she whispered. You're using me against him. Roman gave her a slow, measured nod. Yes. Cala knew she should have seen this coming. She had known from the moment she stepped into his penthouse that Roman Vale wasn't the type of man who accepted things at face value. But knowing it and hearing him say it out loud were two very different things. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. So what happens now? You keep me locked up here until Marshall begs for my return? Until he gives you whatever it is you want? Roman's expression didn't change, but something darkened behind his eyes. You think I'd return you to him? Her breath stalled. He said it so simply, so matter of fact, like the idea of handing her back over to Marshall wasn't just unthinkable, it was impossible. And that scared her more than anything else he'd said tonight. Cala forced herself to stay calm. Then what do you plan to do with me, Roman? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step toward her, and for the first time since meeting him, she moved back. Roman noticed. And for some reason, that made his expression shift slightly, like she had just given him a new piece of the puzzle. You're not a prisoner, Cala, he murmured. She let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Right. Because this feels so much like freedom. Roman's gaze flickered over her, slow and assessing. If you want to leave, you can leave. I told you that. Her pulse stuttered. Yeah, she said, voice tight. And how do I know that if I walk out of here, you won't just go after my mother instead? His expression hardened. Something flashed across his face, something quick, something dangerous, before he exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. You don't, he admitted. Cala's heart pounded. Then why should I trust you? Roman's eyes locked onto hers. Because I don't make threats, Cala. I make promises. Her stomach twisted. The worst part was, she believed him. She believed that Roman Vale was not a man who bluffed. Which meant that if she walked out of here, her mother would be safe. But if she stayed, she would be stepping into something she didn't know if she could survive. And yet, Calla had the sudden, terrifying feeling that Roman Vale wasn't the one keeping her here anymore. She was. Because despite everything, despite the power struggles, the danger, the twisted game he was playing with Marshall, somewhere, deep down, a part of her wanted to know what would happen if she stayed. Calla's fingers curled into fists at her sides, her nails pressing against her palms as she tried to steady her breathing. She had spent years learning how to control her emotions, how to keep her face blank when her stepfather threw his worst at her. But Roman Vale? He was unraveling her. The way he stood there, calm, collected, like he had already anticipated every reaction she might have, made her feel exposed. He was a man who played with people's lives the way others played chess. And now, she was on his board. And the worst part? She had no idea if she was the queen, the pawn, or just another sacrificial piece. She forced herself to speak. So, let me get this straight, you're keeping me here not because you want me, but because you want to punish Marshall? Roman's gaze flickered over her, assessing. Not entirely. Her breath hitched. Then what, Roman? What the hell do you actually want from me? He exhaled slowly, setting his whiskey glass down on the bar with a soft clink. He was close now, too close. Close enough that she could see the faint shadow of stubble along his sharp jawline, the way the dim lighting in the penthouse made his gray eyes almost silver. You ask a lot of questions, he murmured. She refused to back down. And you avoid a lot of answers. His lips twitched slightly, but there was no real amusement behind it. I already told you, I don't make threats, Calla. I make promises. Her stomach twisted. So, what? Keeping me here is a promise? Roman's expression didn't change. It's a correction. A slow chill crept down her spine. A correction for what? For what your stepfather has done, Roman said evenly. For every lie, every stolen dollar, every deal he made knowing he could never uphold his end of the bargain. He tilted his head slightly, watching her too closely. You think I'm the one trapping you here? You should be asking yourself why Marshall was so willing to give you up. Her heart stopped. Because she had asked herself that. And she hated that deep down, she already knew the answer. Marshall had never cared about her. Not in the way a father was supposed to. She had been an inconvenience, a loose thread in the life he wanted to build for himself. He had tolerated her because he had needed to. Because her mother had loved her. And the second he saw an opportunity to be rid of her, he took it. Calla forced herself to hold Roman's gaze, even though her chest felt tight, even though something in her ached in a way she didn't want to acknowledge. So what now? She asked, her voice quieter than before. What happens to me? Roman studied her for a long moment before answering. That's up to you. She blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me. You have a choice, Calla, he said, his voice too steady, like he had already thought this through 1,000 different ways. You can leave. Walk out that door, go back to whatever life you were trying to live before this. I'll make sure Marshall never comes near you or your mother again. Calla's breath hitched. That was it? He was offering her freedom. Something inside her twisted violently. And if I stay? Roman's jaw ticked slightly. He didn't answer right away. Then, softly, deliberately, he said, then everything changes. A shiver ran down her spine. She didn't know what that meant. Didn't know what he was offering, what he was taking away, what he was replacing it with. But the worst part? She wasn't sure if she wanted to leave. Calla swallowed hard. What if I don't trust you? Roman's lips curved slightly, but it wasn't a smile. You shouldn't. Her stomach dropped. He didn't try to convince her otherwise. Didn't try to feed her empty words of reassurance. Because Roman Vale wasn't a good man. And he never pretended to be. She turned away, walking toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire city. The skyline stretched endlessly before her, the glow of streetlights casting golden veins across the darkened streets below. She could leave. She could walk out that door and never look back. But something about that felt wrong. She exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers against the cool glass. I don't get it, she murmured. Roman was silent behind her. Calla turned slightly, her heart pounding. If you don't need me here, if I'm just a bargaining chip to you, then why did you wait 3 hours outside my office last night? The question hung in the air between them. Roman didn't answer right away. He stepped toward her, slow and deliberate, his presence like a storm gathering on the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, rougher than before. I don't know. Her pulse jumped. Because for the first time since meeting him, she realized something terrifying. Roman Vale wasn't just controlling her choices. She was starting to affect his. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Calla had spent her whole life learning how to survive men like her stepfather, men who used power as a weapon, who twisted love into something transactional. But Roman Vale wasn't like Marshall. That should have made her feel safer. It should have given her a clear path forward, an obvious exit out of whatever war she had stepped into the moment she entered his penthouse. Instead, it made everything worse. Because men like Marshall Everhart were predictable. They lied, they manipulated, they betrayed. You could see their angles, track their tells, brace yourself for the inevitable moment when they turned on you. But Roman? Roman was an entirely different kind of danger. And the worst part? He hadn't done a single thing to hurt her. Yet. Calla hated that thought. Hated that she was standing by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, staring at the New York skyline like it held the answers to all her questions. She could leave. He had given her that choice. But deep down, she knew the truth. It wasn't Roman keeping her here anymore. It was her own goddamn curiosity. She turned back toward him. He was still standing near the bar, still watching her with that sharp, calculating expression. He wasn't leaning, wasn't relaxed, he was waiting. For what? For her to make a move. To test him. To decide what kind of woman she was going to be. Calla's stomach twisted. You said Marshall owes you. Roman nodded once, slow. He does. She crossed her arms. What did he do? Roman exhaled, rolling his whiskey glass between his fingers before setting it down with a soft clink. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He stole from me. Her stomach tightened. How much? Roman's lips quirked slightly, but there was no humor in it. You think this is about money? She hesitated. Isn't it? Roman's jaw flexed. Marshall Everhart could have lost me $100 million, and I wouldn't have blinked. That's not what this is about. A slow chill ran down her spine. Then what is it about? Roman's grip on the glass tightened slightly, just enough for her to notice, before he let go and shoved his hands into his pockets. Calla hadn't seen him look this tense before. And that terrified her. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Your stepfather made the wrong enemy. Her pulse jumped. There was something else in his voice, something unspoken, something bigger than money, bigger than business deals, bigger than anything she had expected. Calla's throat tightened. What did he do, Roman? Roman studied her for a long moment, like he was trying to decide how much to tell her. Then, finally, he spoke. 2 years ago, he cost someone their life. Everything inside her stilled. What? Roman's voice remained calm, but there was an edge beneath it, a quiet, controlled rage. Marshall got involved with the wrong people. Made deals he couldn't pay back. When it came time to settle his debts, someone else paid the price. Cala's breath hitched. Who? Roman didn't blink. My brother. Her heart stopped. The room tilted, the air pressing in on her lungs, making it impossible to breathe. His brother. Marshall had gotten Roman Vale's brother killed. Cala's hands shook. She took a step back, but she had nowhere to go. She had known Marshall was a liar. A con man. A man who ruined lives with a smile on his face. But she had never imagined, never once thought, that he had gotten someone killed. And now, she was standing in that dead man's brother's penthouse, with no idea what the hell to do next. Roman must have seen the panic on her face, because his expression softened, just slightly, barely enough to notice. You didn't know, he murmured. She shook her head, hating the way her throat burned. No. Roman exhaled, long and slow. I thought maybe you did. Cala forced herself to meet his gaze. Would it have changed anything if I had? His jaw tightened slightly. I don't know. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, quietly, Cala asked, Is that why you let me come here? Roman didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned, running a hand through his dark hair, looking for the first time like a man who wasn't sure what to do next. Cala's stomach twisted. She wasn't just here because Marshall owed him. She was here because Roman had wanted to see her, to test her, to figure out if she was just another extension of the man who had destroyed his family. And now? Now, she wasn't sure what the answer was anymore. Her stepfather had sent her here to be ruined. But maybe the real danger wasn't what Roman could do to her. Maybe it was what she might start feeling for him. Because for the first time since walking into his penthouse, she wasn't sure who was really in control anymore. Cala had always believed that trust was a dangerous thing. She had learned that lesson the hard way, over and over again, growing up under Marshall Everhart's roof. Trust made you weak, made you vulnerable, made it too easy for people to twist your loyalty into a weapon against you. And yet, here she was. Standing in Roman Vale's penthouse, knowing everything she now knew, and she wasn't running. She should have been. She should have grabbed her coat, walked out the door, and never looked back. Because staying here. Staying meant trusting him. And trust, for Cala Everhart, had never been anything but a slow kind of suicide. The silence between them stretched like a blade, sharp and unrelenting. Roman stood just a few feet away from her, hands shoved into his pockets, his expression unreadable. The revelation about his brother, about Marshall's role in his death, had shattered something between them, something fragile, something unspoken. And now, Cala had to decide what the hell she was going to do next. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe. Your brother. Roman didn't move. Didn't blink. Yes. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. What happened to him? Roman exhaled, slow and controlled, but she didn't miss the tension in his shoulders. I don't know the details, he admitted. But I know Marshall was involved. He was working with a group, investors, criminals, people who don't leave loose ends. My brother, Caleb, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He found out something he shouldn't have. And they made sure he never got the chance to speak. Cala's stomach twisted. Roman's voice remained steady, but there was something dangerous beneath it, something lethal. And Marshall, she asked. Roman's lips curled slightly, but there was no humor in it. Marshall survived. Caleb didn't. The weight of those words settled over her like a heavy fog. She had known her stepfather was a liar, a manipulator, a man who played games with people's lives like they were nothing but numbers in his ledger. But this? This was so much worse. Calla wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the growing unease crawling through her chest. So what happens now? Roman tilted his head slightly, studying her. That depends on you. She frowned. Me? You can leave, he said, his voice even. I won't stop you. I told you before, Marshall won't come near you or your mother again. I'll make sure of it. The words should have made her feel safe. But instead, they sent a shiver down her spine. Because if she walked out that door, she knew what that meant. It meant she would never see Roman Vale again. Calla exhaled sharply, shaking her head. And if I stay? Roman's expression didn't change. Then everything changes. Her pulse jumped. You keep saying that, she whispered. But you never tell me what it actually means. Roman took a slow step forward, his gaze locked onto hers. It means you stop being a pawn in someone else's game, Calla. It means you stop running. Her breath caught. She had always been running. From Marshall, from the expectations placed on her, from the reality of her life. But here, standing in Roman's world, she wasn't sure if she was supposed to run from him. Or toward him. She let out a slow, shaky breath. You think I can just forget what he did? That I can just, what? Move on. Roman's jaw clenched. I don't expect you to forget. She stared at him, waiting. Then what do you expect? His eyes darkened. I expect you to want justice. Her stomach twisted. And what does justice look like to you, Roman? He took another step toward her, his presence heavy, intoxicating, impossible to ignore. It looks like finally ending this. It looks like making sure Marshall Everhart never ruins another life again. A lump formed in her throat. Roman Vale had power. And Calla knew, deep in her bones, that he wasn't offering her justice. He was offering her revenge. She turned away, her heart pounding as she walked back toward the window, staring out at the endless sea of lights stretching beneath them. The city felt so much bigger than it had a few hours ago. Or maybe she was the one who had changed. Would you have killed him? She asked softly. Roman was quiet for a long time. Then, finally. Yes. A shiver ran down her spine. Not because the answer surprised her. But because of how much it didn't. She turned back to face him, her breath shallow. And now? Roman's gaze was unreadable. Now, he murmured, I want to know what you would do. Her chest tightened. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading. The moment she had to decide who she really was. Calla had spent her whole life avoiding conflict, avoiding fights she couldn't win, avoiding the dark, twisted games that men like Marshall and Roman played every single day. But Marshall had ruined too many lives. He had stolen, he had lied, he had killed. And now? Roman was giving her a choice. A choice to walk away, to pretend none of this ever happened, to live a life where she never had to think about him or Marshall or revenge. Or a choice to stay. To become part of this. To become part of him. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Roman hadn't moved. He was waiting. Waiting for her to decide. Waiting to see if he had won. And Calla realized something terrifying. This was never about her stepfather. This was about them. This was about her and Roman and the line between hate and something else entirely. She took a slow, shaky breath. And then, finally, she spoke. I'm staying. Roman's lips parted slightly, like she had surprised him. Like for the first time in a long time, something wasn't going exactly as he had planned. And Calla? Calla realized she had never felt more alive, the weight of her decision settled over Calla like a second skin. "I'm staying." The words still echoed in her mind, sharp and unyielding. She had said them without hesitation, without second-guessing herself. And yet, now that the reality of her choice had sunk in, she couldn't ignore the way her heart pounded in her chest, the way her breath felt too shallow, too fast. Roman hadn't reacted right away. He had studied her, those storm-gray eyes piercing through her like they could pull apart her very soul. He had waited, like he was giving her a chance to take it back, to run. But Calla wasn't running anymore. Not from Roman. Not from the truth. And most importantly, not from herself. She had spent years pretending she wasn't angry. Years pretending that Marshall's cruelty didn't touch her, that she could rise above it, that she could escape it by simply walking away. But she had been wrong. Marshall Everhart had already stolen too much from her. And now, for the first time, she wasn't letting someone else decide her future. She was choosing this. Roman stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate. "Say it again," he murmured. Her pulse jumped. "What?" His gaze darkened. "Say it again." Calla swallowed hard. "I'm staying." A slow exhale escaped Roman's lips, as if he had been waiting for those words longer than he had realized. His jaw tensed slightly, his fingers flexing at his sides. There was something different in the way he was looking at her now, not as an asset, not as leverage, but as a woman who had made her own choice. And that changed everything. "You don't know what you're signing up for, Calla," he said, his voice quieter now, rougher. She lifted her chin. "Then tell me." Roman ran a hand down his face, exhaling slowly. "Staying means you're part of this now. It means that when I destroy your stepfather, you don't get to play the innocent bystander. It means you stand by me when it happens." Calla's stomach twisted. "And what exactly does destroying him mean?" Roman's gaze flickered with something dark. "It means taking away every last piece of power he has. It means making sure that no one ever trusts him again, that he loses everything he spent his miserable life building." Her throat tightened. "And if that's not enough?" A pause. Roman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, something coiled and dangerous. "Then I take more." A shiver ran down her spine. Because she understood exactly what he was saying. If taking Marshall's money, his connections, his empire of lies wasn't enough, Roman would take his life. And Calla would have to decide whether she was ready to let that happen. She looked away, her breath unsteady. "I don't know if I can do that." Roman was silent for a long moment. Then, softly, "Then why are you still here?" Her chest tightened. Because despite everything, despite the darkness in him, despite the terrifying certainty in his voice when he spoke about revenge, she couldn't walk away from him. She had tried. And failed. Calla turned back to him, her pulse unsteady. "I don't want you to become a monster for him." Roman's lips parted slightly, like she had surprised him. "You think it's about him?" He let out a quiet, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "This isn't about Marshall anymore, Calla. It's about me. About what I'm willing to become." Her breath caught. Because she knew. She had seen it in his eyes from the moment he told her the truth about his brother. This wasn't just revenge. It was something deeper, something personal. Something Roman had carried with him for years. And she could either be part of it, or she could be the only person who tried to stop him from losing himself completely. Calla took a shaky step toward him. "And what if I don't want you to become that person?" Roman's gaze locked onto hers, sharp and unwavering. "Then you stay, and you remind me who I was before all of this." Her heart stuttered. Because this? This was the real choice. Not about Marshall. Not about revenge. But about Roman himself. Was she willing to stand by him? Not just through his war against her stepfather, but through the darkness he carried inside him. Could she be the one to pull him back when no one else would? Calla inhaled deeply, steadying herself. I don't want to be another pawn in a game of revenge, Roman. His jaw tightened. You're not. Then what am I? She whispered. Roman took another step closer, and suddenly, there was no more space between them. His hands came up, not touching her, but so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. You tell me, he murmured. Her heart slammed against her ribs. This was it. The moment she had been avoiding, the moment she had pretended wasn't coming. She could still leave. Could still end this before it went too far. But she didn't want to. Calla lifted a hand, hesitating for only a second before pressing her palm against his chest. Beneath the fabric of his shirt, his heart beat just as fast as hers. You're not alone in this anymore, she whispered. Roman's breath hitched, his eyes flickering with something she had never seen before, something raw, something unguarded. Then, finally, his hands slid to her waist, pulling her closer, holding her like she was something real, something fragile, something he didn't quite know how to keep, but knew he didn't want to lose. You should be, he murmured. You should have walked away from me the second you realized what I was. Calla let out a shaky breath, her fingers curling against his chest. Maybe I don't want to. Roman inhaled sharply, his grip on her tightening. Then God help us both. And then. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't hesitant. It was fire, sharp and consuming, a war neither of them could win but neither of them wanted to stop fighting. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about them. And Calla knew, as she kissed him back, as she let herself fall into the fire, that she was no longer just a pawn in someone else's game. She was a player now. And the only thing more dangerous than Roman Vale wanting revenge was Roman Vale wanting her.